I'm Dr. Shammick Kotecha, back with the Kotecha GPS Club. As we told you last week, we would update some of the things that have happened affecting dentists, COVID-19 versus us dentists. So I'm joined today again by Paul Martin from Wilton Martin Litigation Firm. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me back. Another week of hair growth for me, as you can see.
That doesn't happen for me. It has been a strange time again, as we've noted. So a couple things that affect dental practices that we want to talk about today. Basically, the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, which became law over the weekend. And so I've had some questions from various dentists that I'm friends with and colleagues. I've had some myself. So one of the things I want to say is Paul has graciously had written this brief that I call the COVID brief, is what it's known around my house. If us old people who know what the Pelican brief is from the movies would understand that. But it's a very good PDF. It's a memo. I appreciate it. It will be available for anyone who wants it off Kotecha GPS Club.ca, or you're going to contact Paul directly if you want a copy of it. It's a great resource. I will say it's a good guide. Once again, I'm going to say this is for discussion purposes, and if you do truly need legal advice, please contact your lawyer or a lawyer for it. So just to get that out of the way. So we're going to dive right into it. So the CEWS basically is where dentists are able, or businesses are able to get 75% of the wages subsidized up to a certain value. I'm going to kind of talk about it and how we're going to get it applied to dental practices, because dental practices aren't like other businesses. So we're going to go into, first thing is eligibility. And so the question I had is, how can you actually, how do you show your eligibility? What do you have to show, and what are the criteria? So Paul, I'll leave that up to you. What do you think on that?
So what has been announced since the weekend is a very clear set of guidelines in terms of how any business, dental clinics obviously is what we're talking about today, how they can qualify for this. So there's basically several different mechanisms that dental clinics can utilize. The first would be to look at the year-over-year revenues to see if there's been a reduction in earnings over that period of time. So for the month of March, it's a 15% reduction, and I think that just addresses that most of these issues started mid-March, so that's why it's 15% for that month. For the month of April, it's 30%, and for the month of May, it's 30% as well. So in each period where the CEWS will be paid and assessed, you need to show a reduction in earnings of the 15 or the 30% year over year. So that's one way to do it. The other way is that they'll allow businesses to take an average of earnings from January and February of this year, and then contrast that with their earnings in March, April, or May to determine whether or not there's been a significant, or the proper reduction, I guess I should say, not significant, but the proper reduction in earnings over that period of time to allow them to address this. So, and one thing about that is once you selected that path for one given period, so there are 3 periods where the CEWS will be paid. It's the March 15th to April 11th, April 12th to May 9th, and then May 10th to June 6th. If you use the January and February one for the first month, for instance, you're stuck with it. So it needs to be the same principle over that period of time. Once you've qualified for 1 month, you automatically qualify for the period after. So if you've qualified for the March 15th to April 11th period, you've already qualified for April 12th to May 10th. And then you would have to reapply again for that last period of time. Now, the majority of my clients laid off their employees for March as soon as this hit, basically on March 15th. And so for the majority of them, they're not going to qualify retroactively anyways for that first period. So we're really only going to be dealing with these next 2 periods, one of which has already commenced on the 12th.
Yeah. Important to note on that, all the dentists that are new startups that just started up using the second path, which you described, would be really important, because if you started after of last March, you're not going to have anything to show. So using the aggregates of the first few months will really be important to them going forward, correct?
That's right. And I've had a number of inquiries about that already where dentists are calling me. They're stressed out. They say, I just started my clinic. It's a startup clinic. I started in January. How am I going to qualify for this? And that is addressed directly by allowing them to take the aggregate of the January and February and then contrasting that with their March, April, and May. And again, as most dental clinics are, for all intents and purposes, shut down, I anticipate that every dentist will be able to qualify for this in at least one of those periods.
Yeah, I would agree. I totally think you're right. So in your brief and in the memo, and also me reading online, it includes arm's length employees, non-arm's length employees. So the question for me is, do dentists qualify as either one of those?
A dentist owner of the clinic would be a non-arm's length employee. Okay, so it is addressed. If you are on payroll, you were on payroll prior to March 15th. You can't stick yourself on payroll right now and hope to avail yourself of this. But if you were on payroll before March 15th, then you do qualify. It's just the calculation in terms of what you're entitled to is different. You're stuck basically with what you were earning prior to March 15th. So you also can't just up your salary now and hope that you'll get a bigger chunk of money. And I'm sure many people have thought about doing that, but they've directly addressed that proactively. You can't do it. Non-arm's length would also include your spouse. So many dental clinics, it's common to have a spouse on payroll. Some do more work than others at the clinic. That's just the reality of it. If your children work there, I expect that they would be non-arm's length as well. But for any employee who is I'll call it a regular employee, they would be arm's length, and certainly they're entitled to it.
Okay. So I know this question is not known, but I'm going to ask it regardless. How is there any indication on how this is going to be put forth in that? So I've read that if I have an employee on this wage subsidy, I pay them their wage, and then they give me back 75% to a certain value. How is that going to come forward? Do you think it's going to be a cash payment? Do you think they're going to some kind of tax credits? I mean, do you have any idea? Has there any answers in the legal world, or does?
No, unfortunately, there's not. I wish I had a better answer about that. And I think that the government is probably still working through the mechanics of that themselves. They wanted to get it announced and let everyone know how it's going to work. But what we're hearing is from the federal government that it was going to be 2 to 5 weeks before we had more clarity on this. And so it could be 5 weeks out, it could be 6 weeks out before we understand exactly how this subsidy is going to flow back to the employer. I would certainly hope that it's going to be a direct reimbursement because I know that there are cash flow issues right now for dentists. And if they're expected to bridge the gap the entire period of time over this, it may cause significant issues and it may deter them from actually doing it.
About a lot of this stuff. We're going to do a couple scenarios that we talked about earlier on employees. I think dentists right now are sitting going, they have some questions. Do I do all my employees, some of my employees? Well, what I think I'm going to have you answer is we're going to go through a couple scenarios on, I think, what patients, our staff are in right now. So we're going to, first employee I'm going to say is a hygienist. We'll make numbers easy just for calculation purposes. Pre-crisis, this employee was working 35 hours a week, basically at $40 an hour. So that's $1,400 they're making a week. Today, April 15th or 16th or whatever day you watch this, our option is we have a couple different alternatives in how we go forward with the Canadian wage subsidy, and we're going to go through them. So the first question I have is, if you're going to bring someone back on the wage subsidy, you can change their amount of hours worked, correct?
Correct. Yes. You're not obliged to bring them back at their pre-COVID amount. Yeah. If you're having them actually come in and do work for you, which I don't think is going to be the reality for most dental clinics, you just need to pay them for the amount of work that they're providing to you. But more so, I think what we're going to be dealing with is paid leave. So that you're basically paying your staff to stay home. And if that's the case, you're not obliged to keep it at the pre-COVID earnings, no.
Yeah, that's important to know.
And most important on that point, I should say, is that if you're going to do that, and you don't have that additional 25% that you're being asked to pay, you're not obliged to pay it. The government wants you to pay it if you can, but for dentists, I mean, that might be tough, right? There's not a lot of money out there in the pot for them right now.
Yeah.
And so if you wanted to bring them back and have them on a paid leave, you could pay 75% of their pre-COVID earnings. And if you pay 75% or less, then that is reimbursed by 100% by the subsidy.
Yeah. So if you drop them down to 20 hours, that's $800 per week. The subsidy would cover the entire amount.
Correct. And in that case, that specific case, I would suggest bumping it up to 847, simply because that's the max amount, right? And so it's still less than 75% of the pre-COVID earnings. And you help that hygienist or that assistant or whoever that is maximize the amount of payment that they're going to receive.
Yeah. So the paid leave thing is definitely an option. Bringing them in to do, I mean, for hygienists, it's going to be hard to bring them in to do any hygiene work because we're not allowed to do that right now. So they'll be doing largely admin stuff. And then the second employee, I'm going to say, is a support staff member, part of your administration team, your assistants, your front desk, possibly office managers, treatment coordinators, whatnot. If, for the example I'm going to use is if you had an employee that you didn't lay off and on March 17th, and that you kept on payroll, but you decreased their hours. So hypothetically, they're working 40 hours prior to the crisis, and now they're down to 20 hours. What happens then? Do you have to can you keep them on the 20 hours? Can you bump them up?
So 2 points there. If you have someone who you've continued to pay since March 15th, depending on how much you're paying them, that could be reimbursed 100% by the government as well through the subsidy, because that is that first period of work that they're looking at is March 15th to April 11th. So let's say you hypothetically had cut that person's hours by 50% or 75 or down to 75% of their earnings, you'll get reimbursed at 100%. And then moving forward, there's no obligation to continue paying someone the same amount week by week. I think that you can adjust that yourself. So for instance, if you had someone who you were paying $600 a week to, and all of a sudden you had this great week with a massive collection of ARs, the next week you could pay them more, theoretically. I'm not sure many dentists would take that option, but they could.
Well, I mean, they're like your team, right? They're almost like a family. You spend as much time with them as you do your own family. So some of us out there, and a lot of us have voiced, we're concerned. They are not in the same position some of us are, and we're stressed. So some of them have to be stressed.
Have to, of course.
The last question I'm going to ask you is along the same lines of bringing back employees and putting them on payroll. What if you don't bring them all back? I mean, what if you decide, I have 10 employees, I can technically bring 2 or 3 back, which I can either find work for or decide to put them on paid leave. Is there any liability from any discrimination if you just randomly choose people to bring back?
No, not necessarily. So there's a common misconception, I deal with this all the time, that general issues of unfairness are actionable through the Human Rights Tribunal. They're not, okay? And I've had this case many times where someone has launched an application against their employer because they feel that they were treated unfairly. And the Human Rights Tribunal, they do not deal with matters of unfairness unless the unfairness is linked to one of the enumerated protected grounds, such as race, religion, creed, gender, any of those types of things. So no, there's nothing inherently wrong with bringing back a staff member and putting them in payroll and not bringing back someone else, unless you're making that decision based on an enumerated ground, which if you did, I would say you're crazy. And I don't think anyone is going to do that. But you'd even, you'd want to be careful about perception even, I suppose. Like, if you had 2 male hygienists and 2 female hygienists, and you said, well, I'll bring the male hygienists back, but not the females, there's an argument there that the perception created is a violation of the Human Rights Code, but I don't think that's going to be the case in many dental offices. But again, I urge anyone who He's bringing staff members back onto payroll to seek counsel and seek advice before they do that, because it could be a potential minefield, not necessarily from a discrimination standpoint, but just in terms of getting it right.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, you bring out, there's the factors I think dentists have to think about. It's not only the legal implication, but also you don't know if your other employers are going to go after some of your employees. The big companies who have, it could be the person across the street from you, because this is the time. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. If you make a decision to keep your staff members on EI or to allow them to continue receiving the CERB, simply because you don't want to go through the rigmarole of getting them back on payroll and paying them 75%. And certainly, many dentists legitimately can't do it, is what I'm hearing, because they don't have the cash flow to float it in the short term. But if you can in any way do it and fund it, you should. And that's one of the reasons that you've just come up with why you should do it. Is what if the person across the street is doing it and they've had their eye on your top earning hygienist for years, and they have this informal dialogue with them anyways, and they say to them, you know what, I'm paying my staff the 75%, and to boot, I'm paying them 25% on top of it. Why don't you come join us instead? Now, will that actually materialize in the marketplace? Probably not in every circumstance, but it's something to think about.
I totally agree. I think, in this conclusion of our conversation, I would say that every dentist he or she should reassess their needs and definitely discuss their choices with their legal representation, because there is going to be issues and you need to be aware of them. And if you don't do it now, you're going to have to do it after. And as we all know, legal advice is much better proactively than retroactively. Would you agree with me on that?
100%. Yes. It's easier to deal with something up front than allow it to go off the rails entirely and try and get it back on track.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, anyways, that concludes our talk today. I think we had some great information, stuff that, I'm a practicing dentist. This is stuff that I have questions about. And if I do, I'm sure others do. So I want to thank you very much for your time. Once again, that memo with all the flow charts and stuff and some good information will be available on KotechGPS.ca. And we'll have Paul's contact information on there as well. If you want to reach out to him, you're more than welcome to, even though I think a lot of lawyers are going to be quite busy during this time, because a lot of us need some advice. So please do that. It's important. Anyways, thank you once again, Paul. And we will talk somewhere down the road once we kind of figure out what's going on.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.